Welcome everyone, I'm the Body Counter, and this is part 2 of my Red Coast to Broken Oblast series, where I'll share with you the setting of my book's alternate timeline, the events that occur, vital characters, the nations, alliances, and much more. In case you haven't seen my introduction video or part 1 to the series, I'll leave a link to my series playlist in the description below so you can get caught up on the series. Today, I'll be discussing the French Civil War. The events that led up to the French Civil War were the opening of the Second Front against France by the Austro-Hungarians, the growing anti-war protests and mutinies in the army, and most importantly, the aggressive suppression of a socialist reformist rally in Bordeaux. Executions and imprisonments of both guilty and innocent protesters took place, including the imprisonment of 2 prominent socialist politicians. The protest suppression would only fuel the revolutionary socialists looking to spark aggressive action and revolution, and now with the reformists out of the way, Jules Guetta, with the assistance of the socialist mayor of Bordeaux, Adrien Marquet, would begin forming a movement in secret, leading to the formation of the Socialist State of France's first militia. This militia would grow to become world famous for being the state's best line of offense and defense. Once the initial borders of the Socialist State of France, or SSF for short, and the French Republic were destined on the 2nd of September 1918, the two nations began to reorganize their forces. However, the SSF was already at a disadvantage. While the first militia had been raised, there were not enough to hold the entire city of Bordeaux, let alone the entire front which had now been established. The French forces stationed at the Western Front were thrown into chaos, and it was up to the United States and British to move to secure the Socialist Front.
Then he used his
buns
to buy 2 of every animal on Earth. And then he herded them onto a boat, and then he beat the crap out of every single one.
The SSF were in trouble, and they had to act. Luckily for the state, men and women flocked to join the cause by the day. Messenger patrols cruised the countryside and major towns and cities to spread the plea for assistance. Propaganda leaflets were delivered to towns by horseback, motorbike, and dropped by planes to recruit new forces needed to fortify the front. Besides the recruiting strategy, forced conscription was also present. The SSF had some time to prepare, as the French army mutinies and the Entente army relocations would take quite some time to handle. By the 9th of September, the SSF militia manpower numbered at around 196,000, with the French Red Army numbering at only 10,750. Until the next day, that is. On the 10th of September, the first official conflict between the Socialist and Republic forces commenced near the French Alps, with the Republic loyalists trapped fighting the Austro-Hungarians. Both the Austro-Hungarian and German military were informed by High Command not to attack the Socialists, and instead use them as their advantage to defeat the French Republic. Once the Civil War had officially begun between both sides, several skirmishes and minor conflicts began on the Central Front between the Republic North and the Socialist South. But the most vital battle occurred during the French army mutinies of 1918. The French military was fractured, the United States and British having to compensate for the crumbling lines as French units began to desert in mass. Of the estimated 2 to 2.5 million men of the French army by the time of the Civil War, an estimated 800,000 men broke away from the army and joining the SSF. Almost reminiscent of Mao Zedong's Long March, the French deserters of 800,000 began their rushed march to the SSF front line, except with a lot less death this time. The Red March would cost the mutineers around 200,000 killed, wounded or captured whilst retreating through the enemy's rear. But despite the losses, the Red Army was reunited with the SSF after a week-long march through hostile territory.
I'm on my way from misery to happiness to thee. I'm on my way from misery to...
Once the primary fighting force had made it to the SSF front lines, the nation found itself in a more suitable defensive stance. Or so it thought. Fortunately for the French Republic loyalist forces, they made off with most of the tanks, while the SSF lacked in anti-tank capabilities. Plus they had the British on their side, who weren't exactly lacking on landships. By the start of October, the Entente wanted to defeat the SSF while it was still an infant. The Poitou-Charentes offensive was launched to gain as much territory as possible, which it did, pushing back the poorly trained and equipped militias. The 1st Militia and 2 separate Red Army formations were instructed to fall back to the capital in anticipation for an assault. Luckily, the newly arrived Red Army was able to re-establish the front line and halt the Entente advance southwards. One thing that was hindering the Republic was an unanticipated socialist uprising that struck the regions of Brittany and Pays de la Loire. Not the entirety of the regions, but enough to put skid marks in the Republic's pants. Most of the self-formed militiamen and assumed socialist and anarchist rebels were captured, imprisoned, and or executed, however, and the uprising was little more than a distraction for the Republic. Several smaller battles against Oyonnax and Mâcon were made by the British and French to break the encirclement of the French loyalists still trapped fighting the Austro-Hungarians in the French Alp region. The Entente were victorious in the latter, but underestimated the preparedness of the Red Army forces protecting the river next to the city. Meanwhile, along the Mediterranean coast within and around the cities of Montpellier and Marseille, a French loyalist uprising took place in the socialist territory, threatening the SSF's flank in late October. Despite the thorn in Guetta's side, he was quick to address the importance of suppressing the uprising either by intimidation to join their cause or face annihilation. The loyalists chose neither, and what followed can be seen as an early Dunkirk. During November of 1918, the Loyalists would commit to delaying tactics to evacuate their forces and civilians within the city to French North Africa, which was still under Republic control.
Bon voyage.
From there, they would sail through the Strait of Gibraltar and back to northern France. They could not undertake this task alone, however, and the British would be the ones sailing the brave resistance out of hostile territory and back to the fight. The task was a difficult one, however, as the Austro-Hungarian navy was now out of the Adriatic and roaming the Mediterranean, and would have to rely on the blind chance that the Austro-Hungarians would either be too ignorant or cowardly to intervene on the operation. Luckily for the Entente, the hostile navy looked the other way, as the Austro-Hungarian navy was supporting the war against the Macedonian front by crippling the smaller Hellenic navy and ferrying troops from Italy to Albania. The British fleet would transport the loyal civilians and fighters out of the cities and to North Africa, with the socialists advancing into the cities to find empty houses, looted stores, and booby-trapped equipment boxes left as decoys near the ports.
Hey, I wonder what these things do.
As the Entente would constantly shift between the Central Powers and Socialists, divisions and smaller formations were pulled back and forth from the fronts to consolidate one another, with a series of smaller offensives prodding the Germans in the north to little effect, only wasting British and American time, men, and equipment. This gave Germany and Austria-Hungary a much-needed breather from their successful offensives in spring to fix their logistical issues and pull up their supplies and men to the front line. Back home in Germany and Austria-Hungary, the much-needed food aid from the breadbasket of Europe, known as Ukraine, had arrived, feeding the Hungary Empire's populations. This wasn't enough to restore pre-war meal sizes, but it was enough to keep the population enduring another year of war, which was all the time they needed. Besides a small Entente offensive north of Bourgs?
Audio Jungle.
Besides a small Entente offensive north of Bourges, pushing the SSF to a defensive position close to the city, the French Civil War would grow to a temporary stalemate as both sides ran out of empty territory to occupy. Red Army and militia men and women stood guard in the forests and camps, waiting for the Entente's next move, while the Americans, French and British gathered their forces along the newly transferred troops from the Macedonian front to the defence in preparation for a second trench-style form of war to commence. This was far from the case. By February 1919, the Central Powers launched their second joint offensive, capturing, another French name. Well, how about that? Capturing Beauvais and Clermont, some 20 kilometers from the outskirts of Paris. A follow-up offensive in March would put Paris in range of siege artillery. In the south, the Austro-Hungarians managed to capture the city of Lyon before any socialist offensive could take it first. With the French in the Rhone-Alp region either killed or captured, the southern front was closed and the Austro-Hungarians could now reroute their forces to the Macedonian front. With the Entente on the defensive against the slowly progressing German forces, the SSF would launch a counter-offensive in April from the Rhone-Alp, Limousin, and Aquitaine regions. The push was severe, and the Socialists were able to retake Poitou-Charentes and were approaching Dijon in Burgundy by the end of May. Come May of 1919, the siege of Paris had lasted for 3 months and brought the war's worst to the capital, as families began fleeing the capital and French and British men began hastily evacuating civilians preceding the worst bombardments. The most devastating of the siege saw damage to the Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, and ironically enough, saw a French fighter pilot gunning down a loaded Gotha bomber, causing it to crash in the gardens and tree line outside the Palace of Versailles. June 1919, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war between France and the Central Powers. To the socialist state, this was a morale boost to the revolution. As to them, war was the big bad, but strategically though, it was bad, since the Entente armies in France could now focus all their attention on the SSF and ending the Civil War. Once the entirety of the Entente's armies massed to the Socialist front, the morale of the Socialists wasn't exactly over the moon. Desertions to the Republic forces weren't rare occasions, and execution was often met when one dared to cross over to the war-torn north. Once all materials and manpower had been relocated to the Socialist front by early August, and lasting till November, the Entente would begin a series of offensives to capture key strategic positions under Red hands, being the capture of the cities of Bourges and Poitiers, and to force the withdrawal of Reds in the Burgundy salient. Half of the Reds were forced to fall back 65 kilometers south, while the rest fled to the Morvan Forest region to commit to their own guerrilla campaign against the north. The French Civil War would see the beginning of a new style of warfare, based heavily on espionage work. Throughout the war, both of the French factions would adopt an improved form of infiltration strategy based on Germany's stormtrooper tactics to obtain valuable intel from behind the lines and sabotage the enemy by any means necessary, both before and during major attacks. When the undercover warfare became more commonplace throughout the course of the war, both sides would adopt new methods to counter the espionage tactics. For this reason, the French Republic and Entente were more efficient in this area and catching imposters amongst their own. No real offensives would break out until March of 1920, where an Entente-led offensive broke through the lightly defended positions west of Poitiers in an attempt to encircle the Socialists against the coast near the cities of La Rochelle and Royan. Inflicting heavy casualties on the Reds, they were forced to withdraw or face encirclement, also losing quite a few arms in the process. In May, however, the Reds would retake the city of Poitiers after intense close-quarters combat. As you can see, the Civil War was a back-and-forth tug-of-war between the French Republic and SSF, with most of the battles and offensives from 1919 to 1921 being short-lived successes, as months later, the gains would be retaken by their opponent. Without ignoring the existence of the conflicts that took place, but not making the video 10 minutes longer, here's a list of the bloodiest and most important battles and offensives of the Civil War. As the war drew to its end during 1922 to 1926, the conflict became the most devastating for both sides. This was also around the time the Socialist Republic of Italy, or SRI, would begin supporting the Socialist French with volunteers and light material aid. Don't worry, I'll cover Italy's situation in due time. One of the Entente's most disastrous defeats took place in May 1922, during their ambitious Vienne-André offensive. Due to the deception tactics and behind the front-line espionage, the Socialists managed to lure the Entente forces into weakly defended territory, only to initiate a pincer movement killing and capturing a large portion of the attackers. British and American forces would be led into thinking they would be fighting inexperienced militia forces, to only be faced with more experienced Red Army troops. On top of this, a counter-push by the Reds inflicted further casualties. As for the Entente's big game-changer battle, that would have to be the Battle of Doubs in March 1923, where a spearhead in the, you guessed it, Doubs region managed to force a large portion of the Italian and French soldiers to enter the Swiss border to avoid annihilation, where they would be interned until the end of the Civil War, resulting in upwards to around 800,000 interned in Switzerland, on top of the large casualty count. The battle very nearly caused the collapse in the lines and could have meant a quicker end to the SSF, but fate had its cards on a different outcome. By late 1922, it appeared no side was close to winning, as the Socialists wouldn't simply give up if Bordeaux was captured, and the Republic's capital was too far from the SSF front lines to even be in danger. January 1923 also saw the death of their leader during the Civil War, Jules Guesde. In his place, his second-in-command from the very beginning of the revolution, Adrien Marquet, became the leader of the SSF. While he was a radical socialist, he did attempt to strike compromises with the more reformist members, such as Léon Blum, fresh from his release from prison to secure a peace and eventually, the unthinkable, a temporary ceasefire. It would not start to be set in stone until July of 1923, however, when both sides kinda just stopped fighting, and the volunteers grew tired of participating in a war that wasn't on their own soil. Talks between the leaders, ambassadors, and delegates would begin. August 1923, the French Republic and the Socialist State of France and their allies would cease all conflict. France had finally found peace after 9 years of war, but the following years of an uneasy peace and economic crash would entice both sides to reform and make drastic changes to their nations if they were to have the slightest chance in continuing their civil war and unification. The Civil War prevented the split between the French section of the Workers' International and the more communist Bolshevik-leaning leftists, as the conflict united the two differing sides to rid France of the true threat. It wouldn't be until after the Civil War ceasefire that the division would reignite the political war zone between the radical revolutionaries and the reformists. I hope you enjoyed this episode covering the French Civil War. It is the bloodiest conflict the French would ever engage in, and one of the most pivotal events in the story's timeline, and its outcome could have led to a completely different scenario. If you enjoyed, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below and like the video to support my work. Share this series with your fellow comrades to spread the spirit of the revolution, subscribe to keep up to date on future uploads, and as always, keep on fighting!